It's the Deck Talking Devil. Glad to be back with you guys again. I think the last time we talked, I just moved in my house, was unpacking, still unpacking. That hadn't changed. Uh, but a lot has taken place since then, so let's get into it. We have the killing of a black man jogging in his own neighborhood by two civilians who somehow thought it was okay for them to follow, stalk, harass, and murder the man because he looked suspicious to them. We have the gentleman in the park who was asking another patron of the park, who happened to be a Caucasian woman, to put a leash on her dog per the ordinances of that park. And in return, she threatened to call. Well, she didn't just threaten, but she premeditated false charges and carried out that premeditation by calling the police and making false accusations against the man. Then we have, most recently, the murder captured on video of George Floyd. And there's other incidents that have taken place which may not have garnered as much media attention, but the impact in our communities have been felt nonetheless. And so now you have protest. Now you have what is being deemed riots. And as a consequence, there's looting taking place. And from what I've heard from individuals right here in my state of Alabama, comments that have been made from some people who are white are made out of complete ignorance and a lack of empathy towards a people who has been systematically and historically oppressed and murdered senselessly. And you hear all of this rhetoric, not just from the White House, but it trickles down and it exposes a psychosis not just in America, but in the world, that the victim is victimized all over again, wherein the victim is victimized all over again. You hear people make the comment like, well, if he had just shown the officer his ID, he would still be alive. This kind of comment when these situations arise. And I'm speaking generally here, not just about George Floyd or the cases I've mentioned, but in general. When a black individual has an altercation that leads to that individual being assaulted or murdered or arrested by a police officer, the response by some people is, well, had he just complied with the officer's orders, he would have been alive. Had she just complied with the officer's orders, she would have been alive. And we completely overlook the fact that the orders are not legal. No law had been broken. No call had been made of suspicious activity or behavior. The individual has done nothing to warrant the officer approaching him or her in the first place. So had the officer not illegally conducted a stop and search, then the individual would still be alive. We have to address that issue. You cannot continue to blame the victim for relying upon his or her constitutional rights, which ultimately leads in his or her demise. We cannot have this double standard where citizens are obligated to abide by the law, but the ones who enforce the law are seemingly placed on a pedestal above the law. They cannot operate outside of the realm of the law. Now, I'm no dummy, not in my opinion. Some people who watch my videos think I'm the world's largest dummy. I'm no dummy by far. I know that the Constitution was not written to even mention, yet alone incorporate or encompass descendants of African Americans. Let me say, I'm going to say this, and I know some of my Moorish brothers and sisters will get upset. But for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to say black and brown people, red people. When I use those terms, I'm using them in a generic sense because of their popularity and connotation, not necessarily the denotation or the definition that you'll find if you go to Black's Law Dictionary. So I'm not speaking in that sense. I'm just using terms that everybody will be familiar with, and I don't have to spend 45 minutes explaining that black, white, and all these other things are political statuses, legal terms, all of this stuff. Not trying to do that kind of video. But the Constitution was not written with us in mind. At the penning of the Constitution, we were yet to be considered human. We were considered to be 3/5 of a man. So I know that the Constitution was not written with us in mind. But since then, the implied indoctrination of us into the auspices of the Constitution is that we are covered under the Constitution because we're held to abide by the laws of the Constitution. So the checks and balances inherent in the Constitution should apply to us as well. That's my point. When these laws fail to protect us, then you get what you're getting today. Demonstrations, protests, outcry from society because enough is enough. Here's a problem though. I am not against the protests. At all. I think it's necessary, and matter of fact, I believe that even more than protest is necessary. What I see though is individuals, groups interjecting themselves into this, and it is detracting from the purpose of this. We had the same thing with the Civil Rights Act, how it was kind of hijacked by white women because of clauses and things that were in the Civil Rights Act. And that bill, that act was hijacked. And when you look at it historically, who it benefited more white women than black individuals altogether. I'm speaking historically. Do your research. Check it out. And that's what we've seen every time there's an uprising, an outcry, a movement to get recompense in our community. The movement is hijacked then by other groups. Albeit they may be altruistic, they may be well-meaning, but it detracts from the initial cause and intention of the movement. So now we're getting a lot of distractions because of the looters. And I don't have to talk about the looting. You can watch any news feed and see that it is not predominantly black people looting. But now this is now taken away from the intent of the protest altogether. Because now you're getting the military, the National Guard and stuff called in to quell the riots and bring order and peace into the streets because of these other forces, these other entities who have interjected themselves into the movement, in my opinion, for no other reason but to change the narrative. Because now we can highlight the fact that it is hypocrisy for people to demand justice for unlawful acts. And then those very same people turn around and commit unlawful acts. It's hypocrisy. Now we can change the narrative to that. Instead of dealing with the systemic issue of racism in this country. Now the narrative's being manipulated. Now the narrative's being changed to detract from the original issue. And if you think that people are protesting and rioting, which term I don't agree with, because of George Floyd, you're sadly mistaken. These riots, these protests, these demonstrations, this outcry, this uproar, this unrest has been here since the days of Nat Turner and even before Nat Turner. When you constantly try to subconsciously remind of people of their place in your society by producing droves of movie, Django Unchained, 12 Years a Slave, Amistad. You know, we can go on and on and on. We can go back to The Color Purple. We can go back to Beloved. We can go back to Rosewood. We can go back to Roots. When you continue to inundate society with these reminders for a group or race in society, then it just adds coals to the fire. You're just fanning the flames. It's problematic. And so the uproar that you're experiencing now is not because of George Floyd. George Floyd, just that situation where he was murdered, adds to the fire, but it's not the source of the fire itself. Anytime you take a people from their land, you kidnap them, you strip them of their mores, you strip them of their gods, you strip them of their language, you strip them of their culture, you disconnect the ancestral ties, you lie about history, you cover up the truth, then you subject them to disproportionate mass incarceration. You set a society to where you intentionally separate families. And I'm not talking about the wall and illegal immigrants. I'm talking about Willie Lynch. I'm talking about welfare. I'm talking about a system that is willing to reward, to fund, to take care of a black woman. And in order for it to do that, she has to disown the black man. In order to get these benefits, he can't be in your house. We'll give you Section 8, but he can't be in your house. He can't be on the lease. We'll give you food stamps, but he can't be in the picture. I'm talking about systematic separation of families, the destruction of black civilization, to bite off Baba Chancellor Williams. This is what I'm talking about. And so if you think that what you're seeing is just the result of a George Floyd, my friend, you're sadly mistaken. It's the culmination of George Floyd and Aubrey and Sandra Bland and Dr. Sebi and Tamir Rice and Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown and so many others, Rodney King, so many others, Ashada Shakur, so many others, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Medgar Evans, so many others, Steve Biko. We can go on and on and on with this. It's the culmination. We live this. I would recommend a book called Trouble in Mind. Trouble in Mind. It's a thick book, probably about 600 pages. It's a nice sized book. Trouble in Mind. You go and you read the book, and they tell how mothers in America would rear their sons to show respect or to follow an unsaid protocol when interacting with white people. They talk about how you were trained to step off the sidewalk, to hold your head down and look at the ground when a white person was passing by you, in order to stay alive. They talk about how black people were put into a boxing ring in front of an audience of white people. And they would put a naked white woman in the ring with them. And if the boxers looked at the white woman, they'd be killed on the spot. And they'd be forced to fight each other until one was dead. I'm talking about systematic oppression. These riots, these protests, these uproars are justified. Now, had we been dealing with a situation of nonviolence which was perpetrated against us, then the response would be expected to be nonviolence. But how in the hell do you tell a people who's been subjected to violence to the point of murder that they're required to respond in a nonviolent, peaceful way? How in the hell does a people who has been deprived of peace now be held to a standard of peace in response? What is our reference point? Where will we have learned this peace when it has been withheld from us? how do you expect the people to react who's consistently and historically and perpetually been exposed to violence? Not only physical violence, but also emotional violence, mental violence, spiritual violence. Where do you expect our center of peace to come from? So if the protests, the riots, culminate in violent acts, then who do you blame? I'm not absolving criminals of criminal activity. What I'm humbly suggesting is that when the system that is trying to deem these individuals criminals is a system which has consistently turned the blind eye to its own criminals, it is in no position to now call these individuals criminals. Unless you're willing to run the gamut in the White House and the Senate and the Congress, the legislators, the governors, the mayors, all of the politicians, the Supreme Court, Hollywood, unless you're willing to go through every police department, the CIA, the FBI, unless you're willing to clean house and expose your criminals, you're in no position to deem our people as criminals. The system is broken, and you cannot rely on a broken system to produce remedy for broken society. This has been the Deck Talking Devil. Until next time, keep fighting, my friend.